Welcome to the Stanfords Travel Podcast. Mapping your travels since 1853, Stanfords is the world-famous independent map and travel bookshop based in London's Covent Garden. Thank you for joining us on this little podcast adventure. Please welcome to the stage, in conversation with Julia Leonard, Jay Rayner.
That's a very small seat.
You have an audience very happy to meet you.
Good afternoon.
Jay, we are here to talk about your new book, and it's your first recipe book, your first kind of...
It is my first full-length cookbook. There have been a few recipes in other books that I've done, but I look back on those and think, I'm not sure you entirely tested them properly.
These are details.
It may not have been rigorous, whereas this one is. It's a functional cookbook, 60 recipes, a few more if you count some other ideas. But as a way into looking at the 25 years that I've done my so-called job as a restaurant critic for The Observer until now.
And you're very clear, there are no photographs of food in here.
There are illustrations. Now,
Yes.
There were two reasons for that. One, I have a lot of full-colour cookbooks, which I love. But I worry sometimes that the quality of food photography has got so good that it becomes an invitation to fail, because your food will never look like the picture in the cookbook. And two, it keeps £8 off the price of the book.
These are all good things.
It's very serious. But I recognise that lots of people love pictures. So we've done something which I think is fabulous and innovative. I would think that. Which is... There is a QR code at the back of the book, and that leads to a section of my website, which is all the photographs that I took while I was making the book. So all of them are there. They are not the sexiest pictures. I am not a great photographer. Anybody who follows me on Instagram on a Sunday morning and sees those pictures will know this. Sometimes they're pretty, sometimes they're not. But if you want a visual reference, 98% of what's in this book is there. And it's the real stuff that I cooked as I was doing it.
And you say in the book, if I'm ever asked to choose between taste and presentation, taste wins every time. Are we a bit over-obsessed with kind of these glossy-looking dishes?
Go through, what's interesting about the food world is we go through different phases. So when I started at The Observer in 1999, that was when Heston Blumenthal was really in his pomp. Marco Pierre White, don't know who he is, but he just stepped down. Gordon Ramsay was on the ascent, and they were all the precise little delicate placings. And then something changed. Noma came along in Copenhagen. It all got a bit more rustic, and we went through various stages of let's just plate it all on one side of the plate. I don't know what that was about. And then you get other schools of let's just throw it on the plate. Then small plates came along, and that was specifically about we're not going to plate this at all. And I think I'm pretty much of the we're not going to plate this at all. If it, I've often said that the most delicious foods are brown foods and messy foods. A plate of messy brown stew may well be the most delicious thing you've ever eaten.
And does not photograph.
And it may not photograph very well.
But who cares?
I know. I've got a review of a new Indian place coming up. I love Indian food, but a lot of it, when you photograph it, you're going to say, this is the best brown food. It is brown, and it's brown in a very, very good way.
We love that. You said this book is my love letter to the places that have been the cornerstone of my working life. And some of them are happily open, but some of them, like Amul's Hideaway, are not. Is there sadness?
Which one?
Amul's Hideaway?
Oh.
I mean,
yeah, well, look, I've been doing it for 26 years, so it's kind of inevitable that not all the restaurants I've reviewed are still open. And one of the lovely things about what I set out to do, these recipes are not recreations. They're not me saying, I could do that at home, why do I need to bother going out? They're me taking ideas and coming up with recipes inspired by them. And it's not a replacement for going to the restaurants. I want people to go to the restaurants. All of them are listed at the back. But yeah, not all of them are going to be there. And so some of these recipes are an act of sweet remembrance. There's a brilliant Chinese that was on Greek Street, corner of Greek Street and Romilly Street, called Wai Ming. Did anybody ever go to Wai Ming? I look around the room and see if... It was great. You missed it. It was there for about 35 years. It was slightly different to the ones across the road in Chinatown. The waiters at Wai Ming were always actually pleased to see you. And it was comfortable. And the menu was slightly different because it was a lot of it was Northern Chinese. And there was one particular dish I absolutely loved, which was double-cooked pork in a hot pot. And one of the other things I loved about it was that on the menu, because I was going there long before I was a restaurant critic, and on the menu it said, as approved by Jonathan Meades of The Times and Matthew Fort of The Guardian. And I thought, if I like this dish, I must have the taste of them, because I was a restaurant obsessive. And so it became one of the first places I reviewed when I became a restaurant critic. And I did review this double-cooked pork in a hot pot, and my name ended up on the menu alongside theirs. Result! But there's a recipe for that in there, which was hard to put together because it had never been written down by the restaurant. Christine Yao, who set the restaurant up, sent me over something, and so did the general manager, William Tiger Sin, and we, together with a kitchen cabinet colleague, Jeremy Pang, we had to decode it and come up with something that approximated it. But that is a memory of the restaurant.
It's amazing. And I love that, you talk in the book about kind of food and memory, because I think, especially when we travel, we bring back those memories and they're so evocative. And there were several that I thought were really quite lovely. There was lobster and chips that you remembered with your mom, and then you had it at a restaurant at the Suffolk.
So, I'm not going to apologize for the glossy privilege of my upbringing. You may be aware of it. My mother was the agony aunt, Claire Rayner, sex advice columnist. That's an interesting childhood. And she was due to have quite a major operation for breast cancer. But she said, I want to do something. I want to go out for dinner. So we went to the Ivy on West Street when it was still good. I'm still a restaurant critic. And we sat there and we had lobster and chips, the two of us. And it was that brilliant high-low thing going on. And it was absolutely delightful. She died 14 years ago, but I then went and reviewed a brilliant pub on the at Aldeburgh on the Suffolk coast called the Suffolk Sumer, at George Pell's place. And they had lobster and chips on the menu. And it was that thing, the last time I ate this dish, the last time I had chips and lobster was when I was with my mum before she went in for that major operation. And I think food does that very, very well. It's a little bit like, music is a part of my life as well. And sometimes if you happen to be listening to a certain piece of music while looking at a view, the next time you listen to that music, that view will come to mind with more clarity than might otherwise be the case. And I think food can do that.
And it sounds like you were quite the precocious eater when you were young, that you were not
precocious
put
eater.
off.
That's slang for greedy. Yeah,
but
I was a precocious eater.
That you weren't put off by something. You had, andouette when you were in France, and that you were willing to kind of give it a go.
Well, we had a rule, which was you couldn't say you didn't like something unless you'd eaten it. So, I mean, the classic story, I told this in another book, was my mother would treat each one of us siblings as an only child once a year and take us on a tour of the places she went to work. We're going to our offices. Here's the offices of The Sun. Here's the offices of Women's Own. Now we're going to lunch. And so we went to Rules, which is, a fantastic restaurant which has never been prisoner to its history. And as a 10-year-old, I'm sitting there, and the waiter says to my mother, "Madam, will you have the oysters as usual?" And she looks at me. "Will we?" And I go, "Well, I've never had them before, so I think the answer has to be yes, doesn't it?" And the interesting thing is, I don't remember eating them there. That was later. But I remember the theatre of it, and that there was a different world that you could access through a restaurant. The restaurants close the door on what's outside and take you to somewhere else. And that distinct memory as a precocious eater of a 10-year-old, greedy, really sticks with me. I think of Rules and Joe Allen in its pomp.
I was going to say.
As the two places where I learnt to eat out.
Because you like you talk about the Caesar salad at Joe Allen and this kind of, I mean, Caesar salads can be so horrific, but that was kind of the...
Yeah, so I don't know if you know the story of Joe Allen. It's still there's still a version of it on Burleigh Street off the Strand, but it was originally on Exmouth Market. When it opened, it had no sign apart from a tiny brass plaque. You'd have to, if you went by taxi, you'd just have to say, Exeter Street, please. They'd look baffled because Exeter Street was a back lane. You got there, and they go, I never knew there was a restaurant here. And then you'd go into what was essentially the most important Theatreland restaurant in London. And they did sort of American bistro classics. Rowley Lee was the head chef for a while. Jeremy King, who went on to open the Trelawney and the Wolseley and so forth, was the GM, as was the late Russell Norman. Very important place. And they had this Caesar salad. I'd never met one before. It was served in a wooden bowl, which we all find hilarious now because God knows how that got past health and safety. They had to abandon them eventually. But it was the real thing. Yeah. And I came to benchmark almost every Caesar salad I would have following that, against that one, and mostly find them lacking. There's nothing wrong with adorning your Caesar salad, but it doesn't really need it if you've done it right. It doesn't need those spongy prawns or that char-grilled chicken. It should just be what it is, which is what mine is in there.
Definitely. And you talking about travel, you said, I've never been to India or China. I've not traveled across Mexico, Thailand, or Lebanon. But then you talk about the richness of restaurants here.
I mean, it is one of the interesting issues about the UK is how shallow our food culture was for a very long time. And the British middle classes would roll their eyes and say, we go to the Dordogne every summer and every bistro is marvelous. And the same in Puglia and the trattorias of Tuscany and all of that. And that's undoubtedly true. But what the UK has had is, firstly, a history of colonialism, followed by a history of immigration. And actually, and I'm just going to assume that the default is an act of welcome to immigrants, which has created the broadest food culture in the entirety of Europe. Okay. And outside of Tokyo, which is another story, possibly the world. You can eat so well, not just in London, but in Manchester and Bristol and Birmingham, these great big cities, which don't just have a version of, they'll have many versions of these food styles and culinary traditions from around the world. So, not everything is here, and maybe it won't be exactly as you'd find it in situ, but it is a way into those cultures. And I think food is a brilliant way of being introduced to that.
You had a conversation, I think it was with Jonathan Gold, about this kind of subject, which I thought was very interesting, about the difference between having a meal from a country in Britain, for example, versus going to that actual country.
So Jonathan Gold, I don't know if you know the name. Jonathan was the very much loved and highly regarded restaurant critic, first of LA Weekly, then at the LA Times. And he was more of an anthropologist than he was a restaurant critic. He introduced me to a simple truth about the food in Los Angeles, which was you'll never find the good stuff in Brentwood and Beverly Hills. You might find the expensive stuff there, but you had to understand that it was a patchwork of communities. And you could head out into the world by going far and deep into the greater Los Angeles basin. And he said this particular thing about Korean food. He said you will find more traditional Korean food in LA than you will in Seoul, because in Seoul they're looking to the future, and here they're remembering. And I thought, that's brilliant. And that's undoubtedly true, that if you are an immigrant culture, you are remembering and memorializing. Actually, as it happens, my review today is of a restaurant in York called Yemen Heaven, run by a Yemeni family who are overtly doing that. They're recreating this food of a country which has become associated in our minds with war and humanitarian disaster. But there is a culture underlying that, and they are cooking that food in York. And it's very good. Do go.
So how much feedback did you get when you had the column where you said you could eat better Italian food in London rather than Rome, Spanish than in Spain?
I got a lot of feedback for this. So I, as well as the reviews, I have been writing a column for the Observer Food Monthly, and I think what happened was I was sitting in a restaurant called Maison Francois, which is just behind Fortnum & Mason. It's a really, really good restaurant. It's French food which cleaves to the traditions but also goes off in other directions. And a thought occurred to me, which was, if this place was in Paris, the British food media would storm off, find it, and go, oh my God, it's brilliant, we've got nothing like this in London. And the interesting thing, there are lots of things I love about Paris. It nurtures its cliches better than almost any other city. It's brilliant with its cliches, and I can tell you about bistros I love and brasseries I love, and I'm going shortly and I'll go to them. But they are slightly hidebound by that. And the same thought had occurred to me about Rome. I went on a trip to Rome, and almost every restaurant had exactly the same menu. Mm-hmm. It was cacio e pepe, it was a puttanesca, it was exactly the same stuff. And then I thought about the menu at Bocca di Lupo on Archer Street, which is a Roman influence, and I thought, I think I could probably have a better time looking for Italian food in London than in Rome. And the funny thing about that, there was a lot of British people who told me, I think the technical term is they called me a twat. But you're all adults. The people who agreed with me, it was the Italians. It was a lot of Italians.
That's very...
similar with Barcelona. If you think of Sabor and Brindisa and places like that, they're just, really, really good. Now, you might find it, obviously, in Barcelona, but you might find it a little more difficult to find and a little more difficult to access as a tourist.
This kind of brings us to a point where I'd love for you to do a reading, talking about authenticity, because it seems to play into this very, very much. I'm going to hand that to you.
So shall I get a little bit of preamble? Actually comes up with the Caesar salad thing, which is, I have long been suspicious of when people attach the word authenticity. Is such and such a thing authentic? Is it authentic? Is it as it should be? Which presupposes that there is a fixed way of doing anything. And this was... brought home to me when I was doing the Kitchen Cabinet from Liverpool. Kitchen Cabinet, the finest Radio 4 food show there is. And we were in Liverpool and we were talking about lobscouse. If you've always wondered where Scousers got their name from, they got it from the stew, which originates in Norway and was brought down by the seafarers who came into the Liverpool docks. It's a classic stew of lamb neck and vegetables. And we asked people if they had a recipe and hands went up. We went around the room. There were 10 different recipes in the room. So the idea that there is such a thing as authentic makes me a bit suspicious, or at least there might be, as I'm about to explain, because I wrote something which got ripped to shreds when it went into print in the Observer, so I was able to print the whole thing. So here it is. It's called The Authenticity Addicts, and it was part of a feature on gastro-tourists. The members of this particular AA group regard eating not as a pleasure, but as a contact sport, which will make them feel better about themselves. The authenticity addict is convinced that everything they've ever eaten at home is in some way a fake, apart from the snot and gristle concoction that is jellied eels, and that only by travelling the world and eating exactly what the locals eat can they really connect with the culture they are visiting. This means they end up consuming some of the nastiest food items ever devised, although they will always claim to really, really like them. Stews made from goat intestines with the bitter tang of bile and urine, braised cow's udder in gravy, pressed pig's ear in vinegar. What the authenticity addict fails to recognise is that renowned local dishes like these are almost always the product of poverty, and that poor people's food is generally more a matter of necessity than tastiness. Why do poverty-stricken Chinese people eat pig's ears? It may be because some of them like them, it has to be said. But is it because they really like chewing through the flavourless, rubbery slices of pork lobe? Perhaps some of them do. But it's also the case that in cash-strapped communities, nothing can go to waste, even the ear. In short, while claiming to be rejecting the usual conventions of tourism, authenticity addicts are really just patronising poor people. It's quite a pokey statement at a travel show, really, isn't it? But I do hold it. I mean, I think it's calmed down a bit. But there was a time where, you know, I was on a bulletin board in early 2000 called e-Gullet, where greedy people gathered to share notes. A lot of us was there. Tim Hayward, now going to be a colleague at the FT, was there. Maureen O'Loughlin was there. Tony Bourdain would occasionally turn up. And there was a whole thing. These were people who cared far too much about their lunch. And they would exchange notes on where to get the best this and the best that. And I think what they failed to recognize is that there are just versions of things, and that recipes are not fixed, they change. One of the hilarious things, do you remember the row? The Italians got very cross about the putting of cream into carbonara. Well, carbonara was invented about 1944 for the American troops who were fighting their way up Italy and wanted bacon and eggs and decided they wanted it in pasta. I'm not saying that a classically made carbonara is not a beautiful thing, but before you get very precious about it, don't necessarily assume that its recipe is written in stone and there aren't other ways.
You say in the book, or talk in the book about trends, because you, as you said, you've been doing this since 1999, and that there are rarely bad food or restaurant trends. That rarely. So.
Yeah, I mean, the point I make is there are rarely bad trends. We just get bored. So one of the really striking things is the way the classic French bistro menu, the steak Diane's and the French onion tarts, are back in vogue. And there was a time when I started in the 90s where everybody thought that was terribly old-fashioned, and you know, it was the stuff of Robert Le Carré. I'm just suddenly thinking of a cookbook spy mashup. Robert Carrier and Great Dishes of the World. But we got bored of them and we had to come round. At the moment, the thing that everybody's bored of is small sharing plate concepts. Oh, I'm so over small. You've just eaten too many of them, madam. That's all it is. There's actually nothing wrong with them. We've just got a little bit bored. Where I say almost all of them, there's nothing wrong with them. There's two I can think of. One, there was a vogue in the mid-90s, pretty much before I started, in which every dish had to be put in a tower. Stacked. Which, A, was impossible for the poor waiters to get to the table in one piece. Gravity would play its trick. And B, was a perfect way for food to get cold, because it would chill if it's not in contact with a warm plate. And the other one, and I always know that I'm just pandering to an audience that agrees with me, is putting food on anything that isn't a plate. Just stop it. I mean, even slates. Slates are horrible. The sound of knives on slates. Plus, again, the poor front of house staff trying to pick an effing slate off a table. Can't be done. That's the thinnest end of the wedge. You move further up, it's hanging bacon from a washing line, or putting food on a trowel, or serving breakfast in a dog bowl because you think you're witty, or there was a selection of spare ribs served to me in a mini galvanized dustbin. And it was exactly the same make and model as my then 16-year-old son had in the corner of his room. And I can tell you, I knew exactly what was in there. And it was not an aid to the digestion. So that's not a good trend. That can stop.
And you talk about how we have these trends and fads, and then there are these restaurants like, I think it's Oslo Court.
Yeah, Oslo. Does anybody know Oslo Court? Yes. People of a certain age and perhaps community put their hands up. So Oslo Court, it's on the ground floor of a mansion block in St John's Wood. They seem to have lost touch with how it got its name, but I think it's because Norwegian freedom fighters had a bar there in the Second World War. So it really is a mansion block in St John's Wood. It's a residential area. And it went through various owners, eventually taken over by Tony Sanchez and his family from Galicia. And they discovered the local Jewish community. Not very observant, but a little bit. So there's no pork on the menu, but there's quite a lot of shellfish. It's not kosher in any way. And the main thing they discovered was they didn't drink much, but boy, could they eat. And the menu, I think my review began when it's 7:30 p.m. in London. It's 1976 at Oslo Court. Pink tablecloths, Melba toast, duck à l'orange, coquille Saint-Jacques, and a dessert trolley. Unfortunately, the trolley was lost to COVID, but it's still the same menu, and it is fabulous. They do it brilliantly. Anytime you are there, somebody is celebrating an 80th birthday or a 50th wedding anniversary. They have their clientele, and the generations go as well. So people might have gone with their kids in the early 80s, and now they're coming with their grown-up kids. Those kids are now grown up and have their own adult kids, and they're coming. It's fabulous. It's absolutely brilliant. Does happen to have a very good wine list at a very good price as well, because if they're not going to drink, you might as well, see if you can sell a few bottles.
Now, I have to say, in the book you have the recipes, which you've done, but you also pepper it with, the information that we've been inquisitive about. Do you use an alias? Do you try to, disguise? And the answer is...
Do I disguise this?
And the answer
How the hell is that going to work?
It's a resounding no.
It's a resounding no. There's a great story about the great Ruth Reichel, who was the restaurant critic of the New York Times for a long time. And she once did 2 visits to Le Cirque, one as herself and one as her own dead mother. I don't think I'm going to get away with that somehow. That's for people with a certain memory of my mother. No, I book under a pseudonym, often just the name of my companion. I have a couple of false emails. And people go, yes, but you're not anonymous, are you? And I go, well, it's a bit like theatre. When you go to the theatre, the script has already been written, the actors have already been cast, and it's rehearsed, and there's very little they can do to make that performance any better just because you're in the stalls. And with a restaurant, you get there, the first they know is when I turn up. And there's nothing they can do then. Their mise en place is done, their staff are trained, their decor is as it is, the menu is written. And people say, yes, but they can show you a better time. And I say, well, I'm a cynical old sod and I've seen it all before. They might try to send me dishes I didn't order, and I send them. I hope you realise the sacrifice I've made to do this job for you. I send them back.
We appreciate that.
One of the really peculiar things is, generally, if you've got a problem with the bill, it's because it's got something on there you didn't have. When I have a problem with the bill, it's because it's missing something I did have. That happens all the time. And I have to send the bill back and say, could you put that bottle of wine on, please? They're just trying to make it look cheaper.
And you call them on it.
I have to.
Yeah.
Apart from that, people say, do they panic? You go, well, not if they're just a normal professional restaurant. They might go through the door and go, we've got that toss of Rayner on table 7. I'm not expecting them to like me or be delighted by the sight of me. But I will just sit there and I'll order. And I will quickly snap the dishes, and I will try my companion's food, and I will direct their ordering. I have to tell them, this is an interesting little psychodrama. I have to tell them that if they're asked by the waiters how everything is, they have to use a passive-aggressive word familiar to all parents of adolescent boys, which is fine.
So they can't gush. There's no gushing.
They can't gush. They're all lovely, polite people, and they want to. And I say, look, the problem is this. If you say it's all lovely, it's all wonderful, I'm having a great time, and I think otherwise, you're going to give them the wrong message. Better to be blank and not give them the wrong message, because I don't actually care what you think. I'm delighted you're here. I love your company. You're here so I can order more food. But it's my column.
Keep your opinions to yourself.
Well, you can tell me what you think, but really, unless you say something really smart and witty, in which case I'm buying you dinner, I'm having your words. And the greatest offender on this was my wife, Pat. We've been together over 30 years, and she would refuse to do this, to say, it's fine. She would go, it's lovely, it's wonderful. And then there was one particular night where she'd done it, and I was kind of rolling my eyes because it wasn't great. And we got in a cab home, and she went, well, that was crap, wasn't it? It's like... So she was banned from coming on reviews for a while.
So people love your bad reviews. I mean, they just...
People are horrible.
We are, but we just adore them. I mean, the George Sank, that's
they are the
just
smallest part of what I do.
Yes.
And even lesser, I suppose, since COVID. I still do them. If I go to somewhere that's not good, I'm going to say... but you have to be very careful about who you're doing it to. My rule is punch up, not down. Mm-hmm. If it is an overpriced, over-gaudy place laying down a great promise and then not delivering on it for the money, then I have no problem. I am aware that people do like them. They are the most read. And if you just did that to kind of it would be clickbait, and it would undermine what you're doing.
I think we should open it up to some
I
questions
think so
from our
too.
lovely audience.
We have a roaming mic if anybody has a question for me.
Hello. What do restaurants and restaurant chefs, more to the point, think about you writing recipes?
What do restaurant chefs think about me writing recipes? So with almost every single recipe in here, I contacted the chef of the restaurant and said, I want to do a recipe inspired by yours. It's not yours, although, well, there's some questions. Some of them actually help me quite directly. But I'm not going to do this unless you give me your blessing, because could you imagine what a strop they would rightly throw if they thought I was just nicking their ideas without attribution, without clearance? And I'm happy to say every single one of them said yes. And in a couple of cases where it's a little bit more complicated, they actually helped me. Famously, I think for me, Tyabs. Anybody know Tyabs in Whitechapel? All the hands are going up. Yes, I know. Their lamb chops are a thing of wonder. And I went to talk to Wasim Tyab, who's the son of Mohammed, the original founder. And he told me, I asked him about the recipe, and he said, well, when I was a kid, my job was just to get the 10-litre bucket of yogurt ready, and then my dad would come in and put the ingredients for the marinade in the bucket. I said, did he measure them? He said, no, he just had special spoons. And he learned how to do the marinade by watching his dad, and he is now the only person who does it. And he said it had never been written down. And I got him to write it down for me, and he sent it over. The only problem was, it was a recipe for 10 litres of yogurt. They get through 150 kilos of those lamb chops a day, a metric ton a week. And so I had to scale it down and make it usable at home to 500 mil. I left out an ingredient. We agreed we'd keep the secret. It's not vital. But I have been told that it's been tested by a lot of people who go, yeah, that's it, you nailed it. So in that case, I was directly given help. There may be some other chefs who think I am just grifting off the back of hard-working cooks. They're entitled to think that if they like.
My question is, what's the most critical review you've ever written, and for which paper, and what was the result?
What was the most critical review I've ever written for what paper? Well, the paper is The Observer, which is the only one I've ever... I moved to the Financial Times in March. Last one in The Observer, March 9th. First one in the FT, March 22. There is only one answer to that. I said it in the copy, and I think I have to stick by it, which is my review of Le Cinq at the Georges V in Paris. Some of you may have read that review. I went to Paris to review a Michelin 3-star because readers below the line in the Guardian Observer site like to whinge about price, and I just thought, you don't know when you're born. Let's go to one of these ludicrous gastro palaces, eat some fabulous food, run up a terrible bill, and we'll all emerge a bit wiser. What I didn't expect was how shockingly bad it would be, how full of old-fashioned tropes, badly executed, service that was weird. I remember they gave the menu without prices to my female companion, and she was the one who booked the table, because it was obviously 1963 in Le Cinq. It was dreadful, absolutely dreadful. I took pictures of the dishes, which normally what happens after a review is we send a photographer in to take pictures. They refused to let us. They sent us their PR pictures. And part of the storm that emerged from that review was I put those two things side by side. What happened? It is the most read review I've ever written. It's been mostly my reviews on The Observer will be viewed somewhere between 150 and 250,000 times. That's quite pokey. I think we're at about 3.4 million. It became headlines around, I mean, this is baffling to me, but it did. It became headlines around the world. In all countries bar one, it was gleeful. They loved it. I remember one website, Eater in New York, did their favorite lines from this review only with cats. So it was cats with speech bubbles. The country that didn't really approve was France.
Funnily enough.
Where they got various people to say that this was just the work of a rich-bashing arch Brexiteer, which, if you know my work, is hilarious. And that's about it. So yeah, it was the gift that keeps on giving.
What is the most delicious dish that you ever tried on MasterChef?
Oh.
The most delicious dish. I mean, it's very hard, that. I've been on MasterChef for 18 years.
Wow.
I've been involved with 2 of the franchises, amateur and pro, all the way through that, and sometimes do celebrity. I think we can agree that the most delicious dish didn't come from celebrity, though it's fun to watch. I'm trying to think. One of the things that sticks in my mind was it was pro, Marianne Lum. She was a private chef, and she did a rhubarb tart tatin. And I remember, just apart from the fact that it was delicious, it was technically a miracle. Because if you cook with rhubarb, anybody who's ever cooked with rhubarb, it is going to make everything you cook wet. It will leak everywhere. And I don't know how she did it in the time she had, but it was that perfect balance of sweet and sour. It was sticky, it was caramelized. Absolute genius. I don't know if it's the greatest thing I've ever eaten, but it's one of those that sticks in my mind. Right. Who's next?
Well, he caught me. I was going to ask you on the more positive side, but you've almost touched on it. In your travels, what was the most unexpected pleasure that was placed in front of you, and which country?
Oh, the most unexpected pleasure. I mean, outside the UK, it doesn't really happen because, you know, I'm doing my research. So nothing's really unexpectedly nice unless I've screwed up monumentally. I can give you one from the UK, which was more a general restaurant, where I went on a wing and a prayer to a hotel restaurant in Grasmere. The hotel was called the Oak Bank. And this sounds a little cruel, but I don't think even they would say they were the 3rd best hotel in Grasmere. It was a kind of walker's hotel. But there was something about this menu which caught my eye. And I was the only person in there with a friend this lunchtime. And it was an astonishing meal. I'd have to look back at the review to tell you what I ate, but it was an absolutely astonishing meal. And I asked at the end if I could meet the chef, and this young guy came out. And I said, how many have you got back there? And he went, oh, it's just me. It was this one guy who was cooking by himself in this rather bizarre setting. And he went on he came 4th in MasterChef The Professionals a couple of years later, went on to have an illustrious career in many restaurants. So that one completely was unexpected, although I was hopeful when I went.
Going back to MasterChef, you and your fellow colleagues seem very nice when you're reviewing something.
Does this surprise you?
I was just wondering if, when you've tasted something that's really awful, how do you get, you say it's something nice, would you have rather said something really bad?
MasterChef is a competition.
Yeah.
And you can't lie because the camera will find you out. But TV is, it can sniff fakery from 1,000 yards, 1,000 meters to be modern. And so you have to be honest, but you have to find a language for it which isn't necessarily cruel. Or you can do that. Sometimes William Sitwell chooses that route, and the derision is brought down upon him. If you don't mind the great British public hating you, then go for it. But I am aware, particularly on television, with that audience, and the fact that, I think you have to be careful about it. But you've also got to recognize it is TV. People get very excited about MasterChef, and I always say, look, it's television. Some people cook some stuff and nobody dies. And I am employed there not just because I know a bit about food, which I do, but because I can shape in the time a phrase or a sentence which will be editable and true. So it's a discipline as much as anything else. As I say, my main job is to come up with a phrase which is editable, true, and better than anything William says. Is somebody on the mic? Can I just go to a restaurant, just enjoy a meal? His points of reference are Greg's and Nando's. It's good to get the measure of your audience. Should be said, I have a recipe.
You do.
For my version of the steak bake in this book. Although if they'd had to retail mine based on the cost of the ingredients, it would be £13, so I'm not a challenge.
And you have a Nando's.
I have a Nando's recipe because Nando's do brilliant peri-peri chicken livers, although mine is slightly better. Yes.
Good afternoon.
I can go, I'm just going to finish this one. I can go to a restaurant just to have dinner, but I'm unlikely to go to a new one. If I'm going to a new place, I'm probably on the clock. But if I want to eat out, I'll just go somewhere that I know I like. Where was it from?
Good afternoon. When you go to review a restaurant, is it because they've invited you or you've selected them?
Oh, it's because I've selected them. I mean, I get a lot of emails. It's amazing to me, actually, given how long I've been doing the job, that I still get emails from PR saying, can we book you a table? I go, no. And they say, can we invite you? Well, you can say you've invited me, but whether I come is up to me. I will book under a pseudonym, and you won't know anything about it. There are a number of times, I think, where, frankly, they'd have been delighted if I hadn't come. Famously, there's a chef and restaurateur in the Northwest called Gary Usher, who runs a place called Sticky, Burnt Truffle, Sticky Walnut, and Kayla, and all of those. They're great. And he, when he opened, said, we don't want you. Stay away. Unfortunately, they're all too good, so we went. There's one over here. Yeah. Yeah, it works.
Jay, very quick question in regard to the transition in cuisine that seems to have come in, particularly with vegan and vegetarian taking much more of an influence in cuisine.
Yeah.
How much of an experience do you feel that's been for you, and how has that transitioned in terms of
the transition has been significant. And we all went through various stages with it, including anger, denial, acceptance, and then enthusiasm. The stages of grief. I am an omnivore. I do eat everything. But I have been on a learning curve. And what's interesting is how also I think the food itself has been on a learning curve. The vegetarian options used to be appalling, and now we've got to a point where the non-meatness of the dishes is not necessarily is rarely the most interesting thing about them, and it's just cookery. I think of a brilliant cook like Helen Graham, who opened Bubala, and I remember sitting there and thinking, this is interesting. I don't think I clocked that there was no meat on the menu until 2/3 of the way through the meal. And there's an awful lot of that around. There is absolutely no doubt that people I've done it for 26 years, and it was not a big thing, and now, rightly, it is a much bigger thing. I'm on a journey. Got time for one more?
I think we do, yeah.
Hello.
Hello.
What would you like to eat for your last meal?
What would I like to eat for my last meal? Well, it's always good when you realise certain people haven't read all your books. Because the one before this was called My Last Supper, One Lifetime, A Meal in the Making, which was about my last meal on earth. And actually, it was a response to the question like this. Because I think people go, imagine you're on death row. Lots of people want me on death row. What would you have for your last meal? I go, I think I'd have lost my appetite. It's a different question, which really they're saying, imagine nobody was looking, you weren't going to be judged for your tastes, your choices. What would you have then? And so I can't go through the whole thing, but the book, My Last Supper, a fine work, is still available online. But it included snails, escargot. It included oysters. So that's the yin and yang, sea and land. There was a Mont Blanc for the dessert. There were a lot of chips. And then for the main thing, I actually held the Last Supper in a room above a pub in West London. What's now called the Hero, was then the Hero of Maida. And I got cloches brought out, big silver cloches. And I explained that I knew it was going to be something to do with the pig, because I'm only Jew-ish. And eventually concluded there was only one way to go. One of the cloches underneath it was a big pile of good quality white bread, and the other one was a big pile of bacon. And I told them to make a bacon sandwich.
I think that's the perfect place to stop. Thank you for being a wonderful audience. Thank you to Jay, and he's going to be signing books.
I will be signing over there. So do come and
come
say
and
hello.
chat more. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Stanfords Travel Podcast. You can find us at stanfords.co.uk and follow us on social media at Stanfords Travel.